technical depth there that people who are sort of subject matter experts enjoy it. But I always have my other target readers. My mother-in-law, who reads a voracious reader, but knows nothing about technology. So the win is. But in my Deming book, I knew I won when, like, a physicist said my story about Schrodinger's cat was okay, and my mother-in-law got it. So it was a little harder this time because of the history of AI, but sort of that's my sort of evening job, is these sort of stories I tell. My day job is how do I help executives fight through new technology changes. And I've been doing this my whole career. So just for a quick blueprint here, I've done quite a few things. I think if I added up, this is my 13th book. I've done about more than 10 startups. I sold a company to Dell. For those of you who probably don't know, I sold a company to Docker. Docker revolutionized technology about a little less than a decade ago. It was one of the first private cloud implementers. And then I'm also considered one of the founders of the DevOps movement. I worked for Jim Whitehurst at Red Hat on the executive team, and I do some work for a large database company as a consultant. My day job, and then here's just sort of list of a lot of my books. Probably most known for the DevOps Handbook, which I co-authored with the famous Gene Kim. Me and Gene also did another book together, audio only, called Beyond the Phoenix Project. Those who read The Goal, Ellie Gorak, like 20 years after he wrote The Goal, did Beyond the Goal. So I talked Gene into doing 10 years after the Phoenix Project. And then, as you can see, my profound and my recent project, Rebels of Music. So one of the things so this is going to be sort of a collage of like I'm going to end up with what I think Deming. I've learned enough about Deming through meeting a lot of you, Bill, and Dick Steele, and Bonnie, and like the list goes on. And last year when I was into, and it was an amazing event for me because I got to meet all the people who knew my hero, Dr. Deming. I never got to meet the man. But I've been sort of, originally this book was not around like epistemology or philosophy, and I'll tell you how I got there in a little bit. But I think it's important to understand like what is the history of AI, and I think if we put it in terms of where we're shooting the sort of bullet towards Deming, which wasn't the original goal of my book, I would say there's sort of a historical and epistemological perspective, right? The historical argument is, we'll come back to this, is we need to understand what thinking is, cognition, and what is all this stuff. And I think we waste a lot of time on trying to decipher parts of it, and other parts we don't spend enough time on sort of the philosophy of what AI is doing. And I think that's the epistemological argument. Like, do we have a theory here? And I think that's been lacking. There's been so many branches that get us to what we call generative AI today, but like there's no sort of like discussion that I see about sort of a universal philosophy of AI. So again, we'll come back to it. And I don't really cover the ethical argument, but it's clearly an important argument to have, and probably could be something beyond the sort of philosophy of AI program. To write this book, I literally it was interesting. The Deming book, there were only about no disrespect to any potential authors that are on this call, but I could only find about, I would say, it's either 22 books written about Deming. I would say 75% of them were saying the same thing over and over. And most of the stuff I had to do to write the Deming book was I had to just dig the shells in the dirt to find it. It wasn't online. The beauty of this book is everything I needed to know about the history of AI was online. Even like with the Deming book, I'd have to order a book, from some old bookstore and take 3 weeks to get it, and read it. Whereas, but But this was really sort of all the books that were involved. And then as when you go researching a topic, you find all these tentacles of other places. But on my LinkedIn, I actually sort of, about 6 months ago, I put a list, I put it in order, like what I think are the most. But people ask me which one book. There is no one book. For example, if you want to understand bias, then you would read Joy Lawami, right? The Masking AI. And if you want to understand core, if you want to understand Norbert Wiener and how he plays in there, then the Dark Hero. So anyway, but I do have a LinkedIn post out there that helps sort of that. One of the things as we were trying to come up with the book is trying to do, the Deming book was pretty straightforward, right? It was, the arc was, once I caught what the arc was going to be, which was profound knowledge, then I could just go through his life of, what did he do when he was a kid? What did he do when he went off to college? What did he do, when he worked for, statistics and agriculture and, all that. During World War, post-war in Japan, all that stuff, right? But in AI, it was a little harder because there's different types of AI. And we'll come back to this too. There's two main types of AI, and it's sort of a gross oversimplification, but there's what they call symbolic and sub-symbolic. Probably most of you know that symbolic we also call expert systems, very rule-based. Sub-symbolic is what we call neural networks. So first off, I had to sort of cover both of those. It's really important. Like if you think about the famous Deep Blue beating Garry Kasparov, right? That was an expert system. That was a symbolic system. If you've heard of the AlphaGo story, that's a neural network. That's a sub-symbolic. Anyway, so that was challenge number one. But challenge number two was that you could do, if you were trying to write a linear story here, you'd get to 95, and then you'd have to go back to 1943, and then you have to go back to 1970. And so I found that if I could break it up into how, sort of how a human thinks, how to count, how to think, so each section then can be somewhat linear within the sort of thread of thinking, learning, reading, singing, speaking. And so the question for all this, right, why get so excited about the philosophy or what Deming, it's kind of obvious, I think everybody's asking the question, what would Deming do? How would he apply it? So I'm seeing a lot of people sort of paste profound knowledge on it, and it's no disrespect to them, but I think it's kind of a lot deeper than, just, pasting profound knowledge. And again, I promise you we'll get to that in the end. And I don't have the answers. I know enough about Deming, to put myself in a position, or I can say this, for those of you who read my profound knowledge, the whole last third of my book was after he died, right? So I did take some leaps of faith to say, how would Deming deal with crypto? How would he deal with cyber? How would he deal with DevOps and lean and that, all these things that happened after he died, right? And I think I did a pretty good job. So I'm trying to do somewhat similar here, but this is way more complex. But why now? I think one of the things I think is interesting is in my research, I found that benchmarks. If you sort of follow what's going on in AI, right? Every sort of other day, there's somebody screaming and hollering about now it can do math better than ever, or it can do this. And so in my research, the first real benchmark was 1998. And those are two milestones. I won't get into the end of this, but that's still the first commercial implementation of a neural network. It was actually allowed. It was a program by a guy named Jan LeCun that basically allowed the post office to read zip code numbers. They took 80,000 or 90,000 middle school handwriting, train a model. And then the other one is the beginning of what ultimately became Siri, which is Dragon Systems. And all that stuff on the right is cool history, like Deep Blue. But if you notice, if we get until the last decade, the growth is, sort of, slanted. But then all of a sudden we get into, we get to 2022, right? That's when ChatGPT comes out. Things just go vertical, right? And so the benchmarks. But this year, it's even gotten crazier. So this is Mary Meeker. Mary Meeker is sort of the Silicon Valley oracle. People look for her to sort of tell us, Mary, what we should do. I'm so confused. No, she's pretty awesome. But there's some interesting points in this thing that came out about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. So the growth, as you can imagine, ChatGPT monthly user growth is, look at that, 90% outside of North America. We've been talking about globalization forever, but we're there. 90% of the use of ChatGPT is outside of North America, and we really have sort of horizontalized, sort of technology. For those of you who know, source code, GitHub AI repository, up 175%. I'm not arguing that there is, people keep talking about it's going to replace humans. I mean, I've been doing this 45 years now, and I can't tell you how many technology waves were that question. I mean, in 1980, I was involved in something called automated operations, where we took messages where 10 poor people would have to sit in front of 15 consoles each, and automatically have to, I got to reply to that. We automated that. And you could, if that stuff's online from 1980, but you could see horror stories about how it was going to put, operators out, computer operators out of business. And there's a Jevons paradox, right? It happens every time, and I'm pretty certain that this is the case now, where, when you create Jevons paradox in sort of a gross overview explanation is, when you build an abstraction, it creates a more abundance of use. Right? We've seen that so many times. So I think the numbers are going to start out. We're going to see more coders, more people are going to be coders. It's just going to be a different type of coding. And then I think just to finish up on the benchmark discussion, you can look at benchmarks and say, all right, it's a bunch of nonsense because, this is not a human, this computer thing we got. But at the same token, it's a good way to, not really a pun, but benchmark what's happening. And the two I find the most interesting is the GPQA, which is sort of a Google scientific reason. This is a reasoning model. In general, I think it's supposed to mean if you had a master's or PhD in chemistry, how well would you do in biology? That kind of thing. So you have an assumed level of knowledge in a subject. And a year ago, this reasoning model was at 60%. Now it's at 85%. So you can't deny what these engines are doing. And then in coding, it's just off the chart. Coding was 70% a year ago, and now the top 4 or 5 models are within a point of 99%. This means right now, unequivocally, you can make arguments about how well it can't do this or can't do that or will never do this. From a coding perspective, we are basically topping out at a senior level developer that AI can produce. Now, there's a lot of baggage to that, and again, that's a longer conversation. In DevOps, we basically have been doing for 10 years some research on all things about operations research, and operations in terms of what we call DevOps, operators and developers, not operations research. It's in a discipline. But the numbers are off the chart, and that's not really the point of this slide. The thing I'm concerned about, and this is what I spend a lot of my time trying to advise executives, is we're not stopping this technology. Can't stop it. I always think about when Austin Airport tried to stop Uber. That didn't go well, right? It doesn't work. We're not going to stop it. So the thing I worry about now is, since we can't stop it, how do we tame it? And one of the interesting things they found in last year's survey of not only seeing all this growth, but there's some red flags. And some of the red flags are that we're not seeing the efficiencies. So we're seeing this beautiful growth of everybody's more developers, more cognition, more tools for summarizing. But we're seeing from the operational side, and this could be just the, what we call the J curve. We could be sort of bottom, we've gone through the hype cycle. But it could be something else. So it could be we're just starting to put together really bad architectures. But it's worth now we have some data to show that that not everything's perfect. And the other thing that, like, I don't know if you've probably heard of vibe coding. I know that in our world, the devil is like, and if anybody's thinking I don't think this stuff is awesome, you're wrong. I love it. I use it now. I use it for research. I do it for coding. I code more now than I've coded in my probably last couple of years. I've coded more than I've coded in the last 15 years. But one of the paradox is, the easier it is to start, the easier to believe you're done. And I think that's a scary thing that we have to deal with. So let's get to the point where what I call the philosophy of AI. Right? So I was chugging along. I'd about 70 or 80% done with the book. I read a really good friend named John Allspar, who was into complex systems, critical safety. His mentor is Dr. Woods. Dr. Woods is the premier cognitive scientist on safety at Ohio State. As soon as he got his PhD, his first job was 3 Mile Island to figure out the human factors of 3 Mile Island. He's done the postmortem on the Columbia Challenger. Any large event, testified in front of Congress. I mean, he is pretty much the single, probably most important safety science, cognitive science. So I called my friend John. I said, hey, I'm writing another book. And she said, what's it about? And he says, it's about AI. And of course you are, I'm a cliche. But I told him about Herbert Simon is a big part of my Deming book, right? When I was trying to explain systems thinking in my Deming book, I use Herbert Simon, if you're familiar with bounded rationality, I use that. And then, so I told, John, Dr. Woods is going to want to talk to me. Dr. Woods, never really wants to talk to me. He's a brilliant man. But all of a sudden he wanted to encourage me. He was afraid that I was going to write a book that was just going to overemphasize how great AI is. And it turns out he studied with Herbert Simon at CMU. And we had this long conversation about the epistemological approach. And he asked me, as a favor, to cover some of this stuff. I had no plans on doing it, but a guy like Dr. Woods asked me to do that. It's like if Bill Bellows asked me to write a chapter, I would write it. I would, okay, Bill, got it. That's the way I feel about Dr. Woods. And so I started really thinking about this, and there was a couple of books that were really interesting in this. One, Dr. Woods' sort of main premise here was around abductive reasoning. And this gets really glorious too. And again, I don't have all the answers, but I mean, I think there's a treasure trove of discovery here. Because if you know abductive reasoning, you know who was the father of abductive reasoning? Peirce. C.S. Peirce, right? Along with pragmatism and how we all know how he influenced Deming, or pragmatism influenced Deming through C.I. Lewis, but also, if you go digging on Peirce, he's the father of abductive reasoning. And so a lot of Dr. Woods' argument is around abductive reasoning, and I'll circle back to that. And then there's another great book, and I call these sort of the anti-AGIers, right? Artificial general intelligence is the massive debate right now. Will a computer be, will these things be as intelligent as humans, or to be able to do the tasks that humans do across the board? Eric Larson, the book called The Myth of AI, is another. He grounds his whole theory on Peirce. And so it just started me thinking, are we even having? There's a couple of people on the outskirts screaming out about abductive reasoning, which actually is a very valid argument. And then there's guys probably may have heard of him, Ray Kurzweil, who think the singularity is happening in about 4 years. The AGI, he has a date for it in 2027. Right? So there's a large spectrum, but the small voices are these ones who are really looking at the epistemological, and that's where I go. I want to go there. I don't have, as I say, as a dog in the race, or I'm just interested in the conversation. And so a good friend of mine, Lakesh Raghavan, he said, we were having a conversation about this, to study science, you have to understand the philosophy of science. To study AI, you have to understand the philosophy of AI. And again, I don't know that we're having those discussions. And another thing I think was really, so I started thinking, how do I write? So the whole point, I said, okay, I'm going to I'm going to take the challenge from Dr. Willis. I'm not going to change my book because it's very storytelling. Michael Lewis doesn't write the philosophy of money, Moneyball. But I figured, okay, I promised them, so I'll do an epilogue. And I'll call it the philosophy of AI. Okay. And I'm like, okay, now, John, what do you do? Big shot. You got a name. You got a brilliant professor asking you to do this. Now you're in big trouble. So I really struggled to come up with, I run this like 10 times. This one now is terrible. Because, an epilogue, you got to stick the landing. But I didn't have an epilogue in my debut book, So it's the first time I've ever written an epilogue for a book. And I'm like, it really has to, you can't end the book. You got to do this. And but one of the things I think a lot about is this sort of thing, if you think about my book is also the sub-theme is that, we've been on a quest to build a machine that thinks like humans. And the sort of head fake is it never occurred to us that we might build a machine that thinks differently. So here's the nut of it, right? And it is that AI, in its current format, is an alien cognition. It is a form of cognition. We can debate what cognition means. We can go back to biblical sense or not, but at the end of the day, it is a form of cognition. It just isn't the same as a human cognition. So that was the thing that sort of clued me to where the discussion started, and it goes back to probably a top 10 movie on Arrival. Right, and if you remember in Arrival, it was the doctor. I think it was I forget what her name was, but Janet Banks, and she's a linguist, and these aliens show up, and there's these 11 or 12 around the world, and they're sort of muttering some things about war, and everybody's freaking out, and so this general, Forrest Whitaker, comes to Amy Adams and says, hey, I need you to come help us translate what they're trying to tell us. And she says, well, I need to talk to them, and I need to be in, their spaceship or whatever. And absolutely not. So the general's like, okay, then, he starts leaving, and she says, who are you going to talk to? And she names the second path linguistics. And she says, well, before you select him, ask him this question: what is the meaning of the word war in Sanskrit? The general comes back next night and says, come on, hop in the plane, helicopter, we're going. And she says, okay, what did he say? And he said to argument, right? Turns out, I did some research. There was a bunch of linguists who had threads on this, what it was. And in Sanskrit, it actually means more cows. And one of the things so now you can see, okay, if AI is an alien cognition, and we don't understand the culture, there's no culture, but we don't understand, decouple how it might think differently. And in this case, she used scientific method to go ahead and figure out, how do I communicate? She didn't make assumptions, right? She used, the assumption was they're here to destroy us. Well, in the end, the moral of the story is through her scientific method, reasoning, and understanding different cultures or different types of cognitive beings. And beings is not the right word either, but you have to sort of you have to decouple what your culture and what you think. And so at that point, everybody else was going in with a sense that they were here to conquer and destroy us. And turns out they had this weird sense of timing where they knew in the future they were going to need our help. So their whole sense of the words they were trying to communicate were actually to help us. And I think so. Let's we go back to the epistemology now, right? So the thing I think when you sort of put AI in sort of a spectrum, and the spectrum is I'll just skip to I think you can think, and I talked about symbolic and sub-symbolic or expert system versus non. In general, you could say that the expert systems are deductive in reasoning. They're rule-based. The neural networks are sort of by design inductive. They're sort of pattern matches to generalizations. You hear terms like hallucinations. Well, that's just probability. The probability was that you asked me to give you an answer. I went and I looked at all these it's actually geometry, honestly. It's highly vectorized planes of words and sentences and paragraphs. And it had the probability that since you needed an answer, go ahead and just the word or the paragraph or the sentence we're going to give it back. That's really just math. It's not hallucinations. It's not human. But then the argument that Dr. Woods and Eric Larson, the myth of AI, would make is that these things can't do abductive reasoning. And I think therein lies this unbelievable opportunity to see. Now, there's some really interesting overlays in what's happening with emergent. There's emergent behavior happening, but the abductive is sort of like I like to use the Columbo character, right? Like he walks into a murder scene, he sort of looks around, and there's a guy with the muddy shoes, and he's got, he's already got this instinct, and some of it's heuristic, some of it's, just something that he feels, and he says, that's the murderer, right? And so, what does this all have to do with Deming? And in my epilogue, I spread this out a little deeper. I try to take profound knowledge as a look at, as an approach to try, of course, we got to do Deming on AI. Where do you start? Because that was in the profound. And I think there's just a treasure trove of theory of knowledge around how Dr. Banks' Arrival, what inductive reasoning, going back to his period purse, what is the thing that we're sort of looking at when we're talking? And here's the thing, right? Dr. Banks and Alien didn't go to the aliens or an Arrival, didn't go to them and say, well, how well did you ride a bicycle? Ride a bicycle as well as us. Here's a math problem. You didn't figure it out the way we do. And I think that's what we're doing today. We're spending so much wasted time on trying to compare, human qualities to this thing. So you have I'm making simple, two schools of thought. One is AI is bullshit, can't do anything, stay away from it, it's evil. And there's other people who are literally trying to compare it to humans to say, see, it's way better now because it can do this. I also see a lot of people that's kind of going right into the middle, which is, what is abductive reasoning in an alien cognition? How is it different from humans? I think there's a ton. I spend most of my day job on how to allow an organization to do an audit against probabilistic data, right? We have to move from this world of it can never do that to it will, and now it's done as a sort of, now you have to start to think about high consequence systems where if you're going to run them in an AI tool, there's going to be a level of incorrectness. There's going to be a level of toxicity. And now you have to sort of calibrate that from a legal and audit perspective to say that you've done your homework. And the homework is a ton of really interesting AI computational quantitative and qualitative solutions they call evaluations. So I spent a lot of my time there. And what's really interesting is, I haven't had a chance yet, but some of the evaluations could be done in Likert scoring. And now you can sort of look statistically, probably control charts on how well you're doing. A couple more things. The psychology is, I think the main point there is, it is ChatGPT. ChatGPT isn't the most important thing in industry AI, but it is that sort of everything the day before and everything the day after is different, right? It was a tool that allowed my mother-in-law to use AI, and then and again I think we all would agree that if we're starting to think about AI, let's just constantly use sort of part of that lens of system thinking. Right, it may be alien thinking, but this is where you can get an ethical AI. A lot of the interesting things, AI may be an alien cognition. That's my argument. The whole Arrival theme, but its parents are flawed with biases, prejudice, and all those things. So that's part of this thing. I like to say, just let's stop wasting our time talking about comparing this to humans. When it makes sense in terms like, are we getting better reasoning? Are we getting better coding? Fine. But it's like where every other day we're writing an article, well, it can't ride a bicycle, it'll never do dishes, or also just we're wasting precious thinking time. Intuitive thinking is not happening. This is just a kind of hit list of some of the more important people. I think I'm very proud of myself that I really tried and I believe that at my core it's the right way to produce material and research is I've got a high level of diversity. I mean, if you those 25 books, maybe one or two talk about Ada Lovelace, none of them talk about Grace Hopper, none of them talk about Bennett Baker. Fei Li is you don't have ChatGPT without Fei Li. So you have to remember the details of it. But you don't literally, or ChatGPT is probably delayed another 10 years. You know what? I didn't save enough time for one last thing. One of the coolest parts of this book is what I uncovered about a guy named Walter Pitts. He's a real life Good Will Hunting. But what's more interesting, he worked with Norbert Wiener, and they actually had a team at MIT. In their office, they had it like printed out on paper. They called it the experimental epistemology. So in other words, and then there's some tragedy of like why things how they broke. They were like the Beatles of epistemology. I mean, these are the guys that probably would have brought us, and maybe not a good thing, AI 20 years earlier if it wasn't for some petty arguments and things. But it's just a fascinating story about how Colin Pitts, Legend did the Brain in the Frog's Eye, right? He was part of that project. That's Walter Pitts. Anyway, so, Walter Pitts is just, if you're going to read one chapter of my book, you want to read the chapter about Walter Pitts. Anyway, it's right about 30 minutes.
Thanks, John.
Sure.
There weren't any questions online, but do we have any questions? I'll leave this up, I guess, for now. You can probably switch your video on if you want, John. We'll keep the sound,
Sure.
The same. So I can't really flip it. I can. Any questions? Everybody looks stunned.
So, yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
Come on, Dick Still's got to have a question.
So, there's a lot of different AI models. Which one is the closest to using Deming?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I tell you, the ones from Meta actually, I've proven actually have. So I don't know if you. So this is a great question because the first answer is sort of none, but then there's like these other shades, like which is. They found out that Meta trained on a bunch of dark web publishing sites. So these are sites that actually take illegal copies of copyrighted books and they load them in. You got to go to the dark web. Well, Meta trained on them. So I ran this thing just to find out if out of the crisis, I asked the question that there's no way you could do a Google search to get this answer. And I asked the Meta, the Llama Index, about like it was. I forget what it was like. I got it on LinkedIn somewhere, but like a character or something. Like there's no way it was in any sort of search pattern in Google search, and it gave the answer. In fact, the first thing I asked is, do you have any knowledge of this book? And it thinks why? It says no, right? And then I asked this question. I'm like, no. The only way you could have got that answer is if you had trained on that book. But in general, so the best thing we can do, and some people are starting to do this, and I keep like tempting myself to do this. There's this idea of retrieval augmentation generation. So I think what would be really interesting is start creating like a common repository of everything we know about Deming, and then we can use any model, any frontier, the big ones, the OpenAI, the O3s or the Anthropic, and then we could actually. This would be an interesting project. I just can't do it myself, but I would love to help. Whereas we created enough grounded truth, use the evaluation, make sure that we're getting like experts like you all to be able to figure out like what's good answers. You can calibrate good and bad answers. Right? That's what I do for a living now for banks. with AI. So you can use AI to answer questions, and you can mitigate hallucinations and toxicity. And so I think that would be a really fun project to have a team of people who really understand Deming, and start building ground truth to say this will never happen. But in general, all your top frontier models, the OpenAI ones, the Anthropic, they're all about equally trained. Maybe on Monday this one's better, or Tuesday, and it's all about how powerful they are at reasoning. But I would say none of them really have. They're either all equal and minimal, or all equal and could be as equally powerful if we trained through this retrieval, what they call RAG implementation.
So, John, is that meta model public, or is that just through context?
What's that?
The availability of.
The meta. Well, so usually it's illegal. They got big trouble. Zuckerberg. They proved Zuckerberg knew about it. They knew they were training on. Basically all these frontier models train on basically everything that's been available on the internet for the last 15 years. But what they're not supposed to do is if a website has a flag that says don't train, they ignore that. So they're already doing terrible things. But they're really not supposed to do is to go to what they call dark websites or dark publishing sites where they have famous books that have been hijacked that are out there for free, and the Meta is the only one so far they know that has trained on it. So in other words, it might know more about Deming, but it's absolutely, because as far as I can tell, at least it had out of the crisis loading, or trained on out of the crisis, based on my simple test. But again, that's probably not, that's illegal behavior, and promoting illegal behavior would be better off sort of doing homework.
John, I know you mentioned that you weren't in this talk going to talk about the ethics of AI, but right now, I think of AI very much like a parrot, right? If I ask it a question, it will gather what it has found and parrot back to me what it's already found. And I'm just wondering, how much is it being used by nefarious forces to program inaccurate information to just have a larger base of misinformation that's provided to people for the benefit of a few.
Yeah, and this presentation I sort of carved up a little differently for one I did 2 days ago for Citibank, for the chief security officer and his whole team at Citibank, right? Yes, it is. So there's a couple things about ethics. One is sort of not it wasn't sort of designed, but it came out of design and human thinking. So a lot of there's some really interesting things, like the Joy Ballumi book is amazing. She talks about the white gaze and sort of the sort of male gaze, and because of what it's been trained on, has this gaze of bias around. So you're going to get bias right off the bat. The classic is, if you and they've proven this geometrically, right? In the way we vectorize the words and sentences, doctor is to man as nurse is to woman. That is, and a lot of these big models have tried to correct this stuff, but just by the way the data is laid out in large, highly dimensional spaces. But then, so there's all that. That's slowly getting cleaned up, and the big responsible providers, which again, I don't count Meta in Facebook, basically, in that group. But OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, and Google's actually one of the better ones, actually. And Google, and then Microsoft, of course. But then the thing you're talking about is, yes, oh my goodness, they're right now, they're even phishing campaigns. There's been research now, the phishing link where they send an organization an email, and the AI generating phishing attempts are 56% better than human created ones. Yeah. I move on at a time, but I'll tell you how scary it is. Encoding, when you ask to generate code, right, it will actually hallucinate sometimes like it does hallucinating answers, right? What the bad actors are doing, the adversaries, is they're finding those libraries. So they'll put a library that doesn't exist, And then what they're finding is libraries are doing just, and then they're like publishing their own version of that, so they can pull it.
You change it 30%,
and
you have a new copyright.
yeah, I mean, so but
So you have
everything,
the tax
it's like, but it's a tax record actually. And then like here's the scariest one. Because I go on and on. I do this in my I publish with the CIO newsletter. But the one that's like is scary is there are these ways that you can do. So there's when you're asking a question in this ChatGPT model, it's called an inference, right? Inference by design is like trying to figure out like how do I get you this answer in this properly. What the adversaries have figured out is certain things when you can do in the inference, like with sort of what they call a zero byte or a way to actually execute code. And so what they'll do now is, if they know, like this happened to a large insurance company, they knew a large insurance company was reading public data from PDFs. So in the PDFs, they went ahead and put these zero byte instructions. So now when anybody runs a question against this sort of data that's been trained into a model, it'll execute a script, and the script will then go ahead and take control of the system, and that's to the user. They'll literally start, sending information back, communicating, and So yeah, I mean, if you're really interested, probably not, but if you're really interested in understanding the extent of the nefarious actors in this space taking advantage of this, there's OWASP. It's called the OWASP, OWASP LLM Top 10, and it's an education for IT people because it'll talk you through what all these like unbelievable. And so here's the thing: the bad actors have these tools. So the bad actors are basically getting better. And one of the stats I saw the other day was that most large corporations are not investing. So their investment attack vectors is going up, exponentially. Most organizations, banks, and insurance companies, our prevention investments are incremental.
I'd like to ask to clarify on the Deming application. Because the material is copyrighted, are you saying that we haven't yet been able to train an AI application to emulate Deming in relation to real life problems?
Theoretically, yes, except for in the case of Facebook where they broke the law and they used the source that actually was using illegal versions of all sorts of books.
If, for instance, somebody that owned the copyrights to the actual Deming material were able to compile a complete library and authorize an AI application to be developed.
That'd
Absolutely.
be a great selling point for Deming next.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, like that's what I do for clients. I help them do that same thing. Usually, it's like their documentation on their product or their system of record or like HR requirements and stuff like that. But yeah, what you do, there's a number of ways to do it. And the simplest way is something called RAG, retrieval augmentation generation, where you literally, like you could say, what I do with my books is, I don't make them publicly available, but the way I learned AI is I took my books, loaded the PDF in, and then started like trying to, I knew what was ground truth and I knew what was hallucination, so I learned how to do all these techniques and all that. But absolutely, there's a gold mine of taking Deming next, and I sort of reached out to at some point. I actually had a great conversation just within the last couple of weeks about my other book, the Deming book. So yeah, I mean, I would love to help. I mean, that would be amazing to be able to take at least the two books and whatever sort of Deming material and it's the one thing you got to be a little careful of is most people tell you, oh, we got a service, just load this and it'll do it. It's a little more than that. You actually have to create what I would suggest, what I said earlier, and I think there's other, not just those, but other copyright material like people's papers, and is to create a group of experts to like not only load all the data into to a sort of a model, if you will, but then create a group of experts to use this sort of ground truth techniques that they talk about to sort of try to calibrate a high percentage of correctness, a low percentage of hallucination, and low percentages of anything that could potentially be toxic, even sensitivity. We could do a ground truth on sensitivity. There might have been things that Kevin said, in 1980 that maybe you're not as, but yeah, so it's not like a massively complex project, but it's not as trivial as some people have you believe.
So,
Hey, John.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hey, John, this is Mike Beck. How you doing?
Hey, Mike, what's going on, man?
Having a good time at the conference. Wish you were here. I got a question. I was reading recently that AI trained on pre-2022 internet content is essentially pure in sense of having been trained on human content, but that since then there's been so much AI-generated content on the web that the training of future AIs is compromised and it might get bad results, something like this. Is there any truth to that? What can you say about that?
Yeah, no, this is an interesting debate that's coming out right now. This is what they call like sort of the synthetic data, right? Like everything's been generated from AI that's now picking up, because now it's obviously the models now, the big models are training like, it used to be like it was a stopping point, you couldn't get anything. But now they all have search built in, right? So now literally when you run ChatGPT or any of the models, you are getting literally yesterday's news into your query. And yes, a lot of that stuff is now synthetically generated, meaning AI is generated. There's an interesting debate on what does this all mean. I tend to be, like, there's certain things in AI I'm a pessimist about, right? And, like, people not trying to really go after the philosophy, like, understanding, wasting a lot of time on the AGI thing. I guess I'm a little optimistic, because I think that the people, like, at Google, right now my eyes are all on Google. I think Google's doing the best work and for this. But then, obviously OpenAI and Microsoft and
When you say Google, are you talking about Gemini?
No, I'm just saying that I think, just finish to answer Mike's question, I tend to believe that there are correction algorithms that will. So this is a huge debate right now, and it's sort of split down the middle. I'm going to go with the optimist that there's going to be correctional algorithms to find, the better truth. And I don't think, the argument is that the reasoning is going to go down. That chart that I showed you, that sort of benchmark, that one of the big pushes is because of what you pointed out, and it is happening, that the reasoning models will start getting worse and worse and worse. I don't think that's going to happen, but the jury's out. That's a great question, Mike.
So then the other question was about whether, when you say Google, are we just talking about just Gemini, or are we talking about kind of other Google research?
Oh, no, Google. So let's be clear. If you get a chance to read my book, you'll find out. Google has probably done more significant work on AI than any other company ever in the planet. I mean, they hired at one point, and again, because they could, and they hired almost all in the sort of last decade, from 2010 to 2020. They hired basically 90% of the top elite athletes of AI, right? Jeffrey Hinton, Dennis Hassabis. I mean, two of their top researchers won Nobel Prizes, right? Dennis Hassabis, who created DeepMind. So they've got so many massive projects there. So across the board in how Google is, because there's a lot of like how do you build what they call accelerators? How do you sort of like mass produce the ability to train? What's the hardware you've got to do to train? So Rob, into your across the board, particularly for enterprises, but I think across the board, I think Google is. They missed the boat. They invented the T in ChatGPT. That paper they wrote.
Right.
In 2016, they invented it, and then they just dropped the ball, and they let OpenAI and Elon Musk and all those guys literally just run over them. But now they're caught up, and I think they're playing for real.
Sorry, John. What does the T stand for?
Oh, Transformer. Sorry. Transformer. So there's a big paper. It's very highly mathematical, but it's called "Attention Is All You Need." And the thing that got AI over the hump, the ChatGPT, all these things, was the simple example I like to tell is like if you had a sentence said, "I'm going to the riverbank to get my money." Before this paper was written, it was hard for AI to computationally figure out whether that was a riverbank or a bank called the riverbank, right? And so what they did is they started playing out the algorithms of putting certain words had higher weights. And they call this the transformer architecture. So there's these layers that say, oh, money, you shift the probability, because it's all probabilities. That's why you will eventually get hallucinations. But the whole idea to get better at answering questions was that they had words that, like, money will definitely tell us that there's a directionality to this sentence that isn't, the river, like the money isn't sitting by the riverbank and you just find it and pick it up.
In case anybody's wondering, like, they got the name of that paper from John's newsletter.
I know, yeah. I wish, right?
So John, I could spend hours with him, I'm sorry. John, I'm wondering, with regard to bad actors and, garbage in, garbage out, so to speak, on these learning efforts, did I hear you say you thought that AI would develop its own algorithms to detect synthetic input? And therefore,
I don't know. Yeah, I think they'll I don't know that it's going to be algorithms to detect synthetic data. I think there'll be algorithms that correct any diminishing returns on reasoning.
okay.
So and again, like the mathematics in that become like it's above my pay grade. But I do believe, and again, this is my belief, and there are strong, brilliant people right now are very concerned about like this whole wave of AI will sort of drown because of that very reason. Again, I think the people that have been like, you start learning, like as I did the research report, how brilliant some of these people are that came up with it. It's just incredible. And I just have sort of a faith that, like, one, Google's not going to let this happen to them. To the people that Dennis, read about Dennis Hastert. Dennis Hastert, he's in my book. At 4 years old, he beats his dad in chess. At 13, he's a chess master. At about 15, he's in a tournament, and he realizes that they're wasting so much brain power on chess, they should be using it to cure cancer. A year and a half ago, he won the Nobel Prize for protein folding, something called AlphaFold, where literally that's the path for curing cancer. These people are just so smart that I just think they understand how the algorithms work at their core. Anyway, I can go on, but I think I don't know if they're going to be as strict as being able to, to be able to say, well, that's synthetic, I can't do it. And they can do that too, by the way. I mean, there are all sorts of forms to be able to check whether something's been GPT generated or not. So maybe there is a little of that, but in general, I think they're going to focus on any diminished capacity of reasoning or coding skills. Because you have the same problem with code, right? Like you could argue that like all the synthetically generating code, but in that case, it's actually getting better. I mean, maybe you could even argue that like the synthetically generated knowledge might be equal or better, maybe worse. I don't know. But yeah, it would be more computational than just like rule based.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that there's good synthetic information and there's bad synthetic information, and we want to accept the good and get rid of the bad, right?
Yeah, so I could have this conversation. Well, you should ping me offline because I would love to continue this. But yeah, I mean, but because we've already sort of like solved some of this already, because what we found is when we loaded in, I think we, but when they loaded in all of this sort of data, this trained data and all stuff, they found there are inherent biases, like harmful biases in the data itself. So that was human. So again, like synthetic and human, there's a lot of people that tell stories out on the internet that are not true. I mean, you all know how many times you see an article about Deming, where like what's the red flag when Deming and his PDCA, right? You're like, oh no. But like right now, if you probably 6 out of 10 articles written about Deming say that he was the founder of PDCA, right? Like that's not synthetically generated. That's human generated who didn't really know. Right, like so, and we've been sort of. I'm not saying that the model providers are correcting that, but they are definitely They've been working incredibly hard at this sort of, a nurse, woman, doctor, man, like all those sort of like, what they found is when they loaded this data up, it was like it was mathematical. The positioning of these words and sentences and paragraphs in geometric space. Because that's what it is. It's really this difference. It's a highly dimensional space with words, sentences, and paragraphs. And when you ask a question, the math is just trying to find the closest, actually, it's cosine similarities of how close they are. And what they found is there's weird patterns that represent human bias in the math. It wasn't that the AI was just evil and said, I'm going to basically be racist or I'm pretty, it was literally just giving us the math of what we've been saying. Yeah. So, and like you said, the model providers, these brilliant people, have been really working hard at building corrective algorithms and stuff to sort of straighten that out. But it is hard, right? Like you take every word that's been published on the internet for 15 years, and they all have these patterns of racism and white gaze, like Joy Bawalmi talks about. And now you have to sort of somehow correct that in a way that it's sort of naturally formed. It's all fascinating stuff. But
I will ping you.
And John,
yeah, I love it.
I feel like when we're talking about this, my brain is thinking English. But how good is or do you know, like how good is reasoning in other languages, and are other languages easier to interpret, or does the math come out differently? Say on an Eastern language?
That's an amazing, fascinating thing that they learned, right? Like if you go, I cover a little bit of this in my book, but like the sort of pre-neural network versions of language translators were very sort of rule-based and awkward. But what they found now, like the math that would say that Sacramento, California, Raleigh, North Carolina, right? That math, and that's not a great example, but like sort of word patterns, when you translated them, they kind of had the same geometric locations. So it's like this crazy thing. It was much simpler to do language translation from an inference perspective, because the meaning of the words start showing up in the same locations, or the distance between the words, right? The closer they are, the more semantic reasoning they have. So, and they found that Google was again one of the first ones to do this with Google Voice, what they found that and Google Translate actually was the one that actually most of the breakthroughs from Google's perspective and overall AI came from Google Translate, and it was it was really interesting how the way these, because nobody planned, they took something called WordVec, and WordVec has all these words, right, and then they took ImageNet. They tried to compare words to images and create what they call supervised learning. But all this stuff just geometrically fell into these large models when you trained them. And then they started realizing they all had like semantic localities, and then instead of building rule based, if the word is this, then it has to be this. They were able to optimize translate based on the meaning of words across the different languages. That's a very layman's version of it, but it's just sort of that whole way that played out. And the history of sort of Google Translate is fascinating.
And I'd say the TLDR of the layman's term was that it's yes and it's math.
Yes, that's what you got. All right. No, that's true. Everything, all right.
Yes, true.
So has the training input for all these models been approximately equally weighted in terms of source, English, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, or is it highly weighted on English? What's the source breakdown?
Yeah, so no, they definitely have to sort of train. There are definitely, because obviously there are so many intersections in the language and all that. So they are individually trained. It's just that they get a lot of mileage out of just the geometric locality of the data. But then to really fine tune a model for like Chinese versus Japanese versus German, they have so the people who build those models will go ahead and do specific model training. And then the whole way a model gets trained is if you go back to that MNIST one I told you about, it's the 101 of learning how to train a model. It's another code MNIST, which was the 90,000 handwritten digits that the post office wanted to use to be able to tell zip codes. What happens is you literally lay up a multi-layer network with all just random numbers, and then you sort of run through a number like a zero, and then somebody basically says, yeah, that's a zero, then it's sort of called backpropagation, repropagation. This just happens millions and billions of times, and over some period of time, when you send in an 8, yep, that's an 8. But, so like that's just, so you take that to a language thing, you have subject matter experts who help you train models where they're looking for edge cases of words that might mean something different in English versus Chinese. So there's still that, right? But it's all built in this sort of neural network structure as opposed to a rule-based. Because, prior to what Google was doing, a lot of that stuff was so very rule-based.
But with the public models, say ChatGPT or Claude, we don't know exactly what they train on, like what it's been trained on or not, right?
There's been leaks. But no, they don't publicly. There's an open source in AI has a whole different meaning.
Right.
Because in open source, you got to have 3 things to be truly open, and almost all of them, none of them, except for the IBM one, really. IBM is the only one that's truly open. You have to open source the code. But the code is meaningless in this world. It's not like having the code to some like proprietary product or something like that. The code is just like a very small fraction of. The second thing you need to do is the weights. Like, what were the weights that they use? That's the holy grail. In fact, what do you call the hackers and a lot of the bug bounties. If you look at any bug bounty, the highest price paid for is if you can decipher the weights. And then the third is the data. And like the DeepSeek from China, like all that hoopla, there was open source code, there's open weights, but not the data. So we don't know what they trained. It comes down to they use OpenAI to train. They actually ran inferences like billions of times against OpenAI to train their model. But so to be truly open, you need all 3. And the only major provider that I know that does that is IBM.
It's interesting, John, our last session with Chris, was largely about how to convince organizations to switch their thinking, to look through the Deming lens and learn Deming. And that's a big push, obviously, keeping Deming's philosophy alive. And I'm hearing from friends that their corporations that they work in have custom AIs that are being, quote unquote, trained. And that means they're being trained in the traditional method of management and traditional processes. And specifically, she was being forced to use, as a manager of her department, the company's custom AI training on doing performance reviews. And my concern is that AI and the fact that it generates something quickly for employees is going to lead them to think even more that it is the way, instead of making them less open to Deming.
And that, I just got nightmare chills when you told me that. Most of what I'm trying to do is help large corporations build infrastructure of commerce to sort of like and do it correctly so they don't go out of business. The existential threat of AI for high consequence data is the market is pushing to. But going back to that scares the hell out of me. Now here's the problem though. This is the one thing I think we like. I'm not saying you, but we all conflate is these are all still human behavior. So you're either a company that believes in the Deming philosophy and the ways of like all the things we all sort of know and cherish of the way an organization should be, organization behavior, all those things. You're either that kind of company or you're not. So if you're that kind of company and you're going to build an AI system to build on that, then you're more likely not to fall into prey to the systems that you're talking about. But if you're not that company in the first place, then you're right. You're going to double down, triple down on being worse. But at the end of the day, like the real culprit here is not getting leadership and organizations to understand how to do human behavior and organizational design and organizational optimization properly, right? Regardless of whether you have any, you're absolutely spot on. Like you're already bad, and now you're doubling down on bad. Part of me would be like, good luck, because I'm going to see. Hopefully, if we're all right, and I believe we are, then the ones that are sort of building on, Deming's principles, just all the principles, not just Deming, but all the things that we know are sort of, I just did a whole thing on how Ashby's Law could be a beautiful way to tame how we build AI infrastructure. But again, the thing that we sort of conflate, like the thing earlier, like, will AI give us terrible answers? Well, humans give terrible answers. Put 100 people in a room asking the same question, chart the variation of the answers. Nothing to do with AI. So a lot of ways, AI just mirrors what we do. But I'm not trivializing how terrible that is, because what you just described might give me nightmares.
We used to call that in automation. We can now make our mistakes a lot faster.
Yeah, that's right. It's, but again, at the end of the day, it's human behavior, right? It's that organization is chosen, or they don't know any better, that they think that MBOs and sort of like ranking and step ranking, all those things are the way that you run an organization. Then they've already got sort of the cancer already anyway, right? And it takes somebody like this group of people who we make a living at trying to help people understand that there's a better way to do this, right? They create more optimal outputs in a lot of ways are counterintuitive to those people, but again, AI is just adding an accelerator. Like you said, same thing in automation. Like if you're building terrible processes. I mean, go on and on, but like if you guys heard of RPA, the robotics processing agents, right? That was pre-AI. That was disastrous. Companies that had all terrible infrastructure with like most large corporations, most large banks are like 50 years of anything from Java to shell scripts to glue to somebody on a weekend put this together, and it's been running for 15 years and nobody even knows where the code is, right? And then you put an automation abstraction on that, you create nightmare scenarios.
That's to be the guy that wrote the script and walked away.
So John?
You see, yeah.
So a question, you had just said a better way. So if we're looking at management systems, we have, if we're asking ChatGPT or any of them, what's a better way versus a different way? How will it, and if the majority of business schools are saying the conventional way of doing it, how can ChatGPT or any of these differentiate and say Deming is a better way, or can it?
That's our challenge, right? As a group of people that sort of like we get together into thinking, we try to, I feel pretty proud that I've introduced Deming to a whole group of younger people. And Rob wouldn't consider himself young, but like, Rob can attest to how
What are you talking
Shane
about?
is a great example. Shane is an example. No, Shane is a great example of like.
He's sitting right
So
here,
we
by
just
the
have-
way, so say
Yeah, I
nice
knew that.
things.
Hey, Shane. No, he's a perfect example. Is I'm not sure he would have ever heard of Deming if it wasn't for me, right? So, or heard about it, but not been as passionate to fly out there and come hang out with you guys. So we have to kind of continue that, like, you know, and everything else is taking more oxygen. I think that. It's the same challenge. It's a challenge with AI or a challenge without AI, right? Like we see organizations build, very terroristic infrastructure, and very sort of, indicator or MBO motivated, and we know that we just try to speak as loud as we can and try to get as many people, But I think back to the earlier question. Right now, ChatGPT is going to give you the wrong answers on management, or what we all believe are the wrong answers. That actually they believe, and a lot of people still believe, are the right answers, including, sort of what's coming out of like your MBO, your management.
I think from my limited experience, a lot depends on the prompting. And so we're going to have different prompts than somebody who is trained in OKRs.
I think that as a community, right, probably trying to create more AI generated, and whether a group can get the copyrighted material or not, but there's a lot of contribution stuff like Bill's written, y'all written, all that. Like we could start creating models or models that adhere to these principles, so that when you ask them questions, you're more likely to get a Deming view. And one other thing I wanted to say too is that, one of the complaints about like in education right now is that that these kids are losing critical thinking skills because they're using AI. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I spent a lot of time getting brought into universities to lecture about like technology and stuff like that. I don't think they're teaching our kids a lot of critical thinking skills anyway. So before we start criticizing AI for being terrible and destroying critical thinking skills in students, I think we probably have to step back and figure out how good a job we're doing for critical thinking in general. And I think most students that are coming out with MBAs today are not critical thinkers. So again, it all goes back to it's sort of our challenge. It was the Deming challenge, right? It's why did America ignore him for so many years? Why did they, for about a 10-year period, they went gonzo over him, and then all of a sudden they sort of, why did Ford Motors go crazy, and then after regime change, really went a Deming company for a period of time, right? Like, what is it about this stuff that we know innately to be powerful and true that doesn't hook everybody?
It's not just that it takes too long. Dix just said because it takes so long to really understand Deming, and Deming isn't like a quick study. But I also think that Deming did not have the benefit of the millions of dollars of marketing and media that influenced people that Lean and other programs had, and that's a huge difference too.
Well, and my theory is that most people who come up with, you think about new economics, right? System of profound knowledge, right? Finally inked, right? Like there's arguments that's been around for a while, but it was finally inked, and he dies that year.
Mm-hmm.
Other people who create Jeffrey Liker or like the people who sort of came up with the first leads, they're still living today. They've got 25 years of promoting this idea. The guy who is the author, dies the year that he creates this sort of manifesto, right? And so I think that had a lot to do with the messaging. Deming had another, could have had another 20 years, but he had 25 years to be out there talking about profound knowledge and trying to decipher it and try to help us understand it better. We had everybody who was carrying the torch had to help do that. So I think. Yeah.
I was going to say, even the people trying to carry the torch for SOPK don't know it as well, because to your point, everybody was listening to him for years talking about the 14 points, and they all grabbed onto the 14 points. It's still the biggest entry into Deming, and they think that's it. They don't understand you can't do the 14 points without the system of profound knowledge.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you. I kind of that's why I'm envious of most of you who've been studying Devin your own career. I came into it kind of late. I immediately was told you need to look at profound knowledge, and I read New Economics, and I didn't get it. I was like scratching my head, going, I don't know, man, this psychology stuff, I'm not sure what he's talking about, right? And I had to go do a bunch of research in other areas, mostly hospital, patient care is where I found a lot of the. I'm probably gonna have to jump right now. I'd love to continue this conversation, and I'm so sad I wasn't able to make it, but it was sort of a family reunion, that was a part. Get to hang out with my kids and they're all out of the house now. I can't turn that down. Even Debbie doesn't take precedence over that. So, but I do gotta probably jump. I would any of you, if you know me, I love having these conversations. We can turn it into a podcast, or we can just spend some time on the phone. I love chatting about this kind of stuff. So.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
Take care.
All right.